¿Cómo le va, gente? ¿Cómo les va, Lanterns? Bienvenidos a esta nueva entrega de protagonistas del cómic. En este gran programa que llegamos a nuestro noveno programa. Increíble, pero sí. Vamos por el noveno programa. Como siempre está mi compañero Mario acá.
Hola gente, ¿cómo estás? Un placer, Kyle, para este gran programa, este noveno programa de protagonistas del cómic. Y la verdad que vamos a tener que hacer una ovación, ¿no?
Sí, Mario, la verdad que sí, porque esto que vamos a tener hoy va a ser histórico, porque creo que nunca el señor Levitz estuvo en la Argentina, o por lo menos tuvimos el placer de hablar con él, así que ahora vamos a empezar a hablar en inglés. I want to introduce our guest, who's the winner of Bob Clampett Humanitarian Award in 2008. Dick Giordano Hero Initiative Humanitarian of the Year, and who also joined the Will Eisner Hall of Fame in 2019. I'm speaking about
and only.
The one and only Mr. Paul Levitz.
Good evening, guys.
Good evening, Mr. Paul Levitz.
Sir?
It's a pleasure to have you here, and a dream come true for the Argentinian fans.
Pleasure to visit Argentina. I have some cousins there who I have never met and have never tracked down, but maybe they're listening.
Mr. Levitz, we're going to tell you that here in our country, the DC comics are the most read stories. So we grew up with all the stories. So everyone here in the show loves you, and loves all the stories from DC.
Thank you, sir.
Also, I think that it would be nice and it would be cool that you can tell us about your beginnings in the comic industry, because when I read it, it was like everybody's dream come true, how you got into comics. So
well, the first trick is you have to be born in the right place. When I was a kid from Brooklyn, at a time when pretty much the entire American comic book industry, which was very small, was in the New York City area. This is before the digital transmission, before Federal Express. So the writers and artists had to live pretty close to the offices to be able to bring their work in. If you were a terrific superstar like Jack Kirby, maybe you could get away with living in California and sending your work through the mail. But that also meant you had to trust the postman to manage to deliver it on time and without getting it banged up, which occasionally was a problem. Anyway, I read tons of comics as well as anything else I could get my hands on as a kid. And a friend of mine, Paul Kupperberg, and I are sitting around one day as kids reading the fan magazines, and we're reading that Newfangles, which was the best fanzine for finding out news about the industry at the time, had announced it was going to go out of business in a few months. The Don and Maggie Thompson, who were the editors, were a young married couple. They had a couple of kids. They had a life, strange as that may seem. And they didn't have time for this much fan nonsense anymore. And we're sitting there, I'm 14, Cups is 15. It's like, we're not going to know what's going on. You have to remember that we're talking about 1971, and none of the publishers in comics regularly told fans when the next issue was coming out, when a new comic was going to start, whose work was going to be in any given issue. Lots of comics didn't even have credits. So, you could go to your newsstand, and if you looked at the rack carefully enough, maybe you noticed there was this new magazine called Savage Tales out, all this gorgeous black and white artwork from Marvel. But if you didn't happen to spot it in the right rack, and Marvel didn't have any other magazines, DC hadn't done any magazines at that point, there was no real reason to be looking at that corner of the rack, maybe for the Warren black and whites. If you found it, you found it, and if not, you had no idea it had ever happened.
Yeah.
So we decided to start our own fanzine. We put together $16, which was a little more in those days than it is now, but it is not very much money even back in 1990. A couple of young teenage kids, working class families. We didn't have any money. We didn't really know what the hell we were doing. And we started calling the comic book companies, asking for news or information. And a couple of them were kind enough to give us some. Typed it up, made a little magazine out of it, went off to the local print shop. And suddenly we were in business. And we got some nice plugs. Don and Maggie said, hey, these guys are doing something good. Maybe you should check it out. An old fanzine called The Comic Reader had gone out of business a few years before. The Mark Hannafeld, who'd been the editor and publisher of it, turned around and said, hey, you guys are doing fine, and literally handed me a manila envelope full of quarters and nickels and index cards with the names and addresses of the subscribers written on it. Said, could you take care of these subscribers? And so suddenly the fanzine had a large circulation. Cups dropped out after a couple of months. He had other things going on. I kept it up. I got to know everybody in the comics business as a result, for reasons that sort of baffle me looking back at it. They didn't mind a 14, 15-year-old kid coming up and wandering around the office talking to people. The company's very small, and a lot of the people were pretty young too, but still. And I became part of the field in that way. I'm walking through the office one day, working on the fanzine. I'm still in high school. Joe Orlando, who's a brilliant, legendary cartoonist, goes back to EC, Mad Magazine, was then an editor at DC, calls me into his office, asks me if I want to write his letters pages. I'm not a writer, Joe. I read your fanzine. You write well enough to write a letters page. Putting a letters page together is not exactly Pulitzer Prize quality competition writing. It means picking through a few letters or making up a letter for a magazine that doesn't get enough mail, and writing a coherent answer to it. But suddenly there I am, 16 years old. I'm officially a professional writer because I'm getting paid to do this.
Oh my God. Mr. Levitz, before you do this, which was your favorite comic? What's your favorite character? Which was?
I was a Superman kid growing up, more than anything.
Okay.
And really, the Legion of Superheroes became my favorite comic in those years. It was kind of part of the Superman line back in those days. There was an awful lot of Superboy in the title. And there were no comic shops, but there were a few used bookstores that would sell back issue comics. So I started collecting that way, and I found all the issues that had the Legion of Superheroes. Back issue comics weren't very expensive. I don't remember the prices of most of the ones that I bought. For some reason, I remember paying $5 for my Avengers #1. Kind of beat up copy. That was a lot of money for a kid.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course.
I wasn't a very good investor. I could have bought the first appearance of Superman for about $130, $150 and made a couple of million if I'd held on to that. I wasn't smart enough to do that. Anyway,
after that, you have a big reward.
I'm not complaining. That summer, as I was graduating high school, Joe's regular assistant, a man named Michael Fleischer, who wrote a lot of wonderful Jonah Hex stories, some great Spectre stories, was going to take the whole summer off for vacation. And Joe asked me if I would like to fill in. This was not a hard question. So here I am now. I'm 16 years old, and I'm on the masthead of DC Comics as an assistant editor. Michael never came back. I didn't kill him. He went on to get a PhD. He did a lot of really fascinating work for the UN in Africa later on in his life after he stopped writing comics. And I never left. I pushed all my college courses into a couple days a week and spent the other days at DC working for Joe or other editors. And after about 3 years like that, doing it part-time, Jeanette Kahn showed up at DC, began to really change the culture of the place, the mission of it. And I got the chance to go full-time as an editor. And I dropped out of college to my parents' annoyance and went full-time. And then
how old were you at that time?
19. I guess I had about a year of college left to go.
Incredible.
Oh, my God.
And did about 5 years in editorial, editing a bunch of different things, including the Batman titles for a while, and serving as the editorial kind of traffic manager, keeping the freelancers on deadline, which is always an interesting challenge. And then Jeanette got to be the president of the company, and I had the opportunity to change over to a job that in modern terms you'd call something like the chief operating officer. And there I am, so I'm 24 years old, and I'm in charge of the business side of the company. I have the accountants.
Mr. Levitz, you were witness of all the greatest stories of DC Comics, or the creation of many characters that we love, and it's incredible, I think.
I got to be there for, I think, one of the most incredible periods in comics. When you think about the best moments for comic book companies, certainly Marvel in the 1960s, EC in the 1950s. And I think after that, you can really make an argument for DC from about the mid-1980s to the mid-1990s as having the next most exciting level of creative ferment going on. Yeah. And a lot of that was because, based on Jeanette's philosophy and some of the things that I was able to figure out how to make work, we were able to create royalty plans for the talent, participations for them in new characters they created. And that wasn't brain surgery, that people would do better work if they had a share in its success. Yeah. But it was radical for comics at the time. American comics were very backward in how they treated their creative people. The big companies paid honestly. You made a decent middle class living if you were working steadily. But it was viewed as sort of the equivalent of making processed meat. This is or fast food. We throw the hamburgers on. There's a recipe for the hamburgers. No one really cares who's making the hamburger. You don't sign the goddamn menu. And what was very clear is that if we upped the scale of it a little bit and said, look, if we win, you will win. At the same time, comics in America were moving from the newsstand to the comic shop, so the audience was getting a little older, potentially willing to spend a little more money, certainly a little better informed about who the creative people were. Mm-hmm. So maybe if you told them, this new thing is created by Frank Miller, they might show up in a way that they wouldn't if it was a new thing created by Paul Levitz. And by giving people like Frank a stake in the work, they were willing to try things, to experiment, and some of those things have paid great result both for DC for decades to follow and to the creator. So you have people who did work for DC in 1985, or I'm thinking of Sandman with Neil Gaiman in 1989. Is it 30 years since then?
Yes.
And he's still, he's constantly getting good checks, and they're doing a new Sandman television series. They've had the Lucifer television series. Neil's been able to get checks from all of that to participate creatively in some ways that he wanted to. It changed the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And
totally.
At the same time, it wasn't just DC. There were a lot of independent companies that were starting to do things like that. But it was unusual for DC, which was the oldest comic book company. It was the one that was at the time owned by the biggest corporation. So you don't usually expect the legacy company in any industry to be the innovative company. And I think, as objectively as I can be, I think we were clearly the most innovative large company in the field at that point. And that's a terrific thing to be able to look back on being a part of.
It was hard working with the Comics Code Authority. It was a difficult time for DC.
The code had a major negative effect on the business in its first, I'd say, 15 years, the mid-1950s to about 1970.
Yes.
It really stunted the creativity and really prevented people from doing their best work. By 1970, it was beginning to get weaker. And by the late 1970s, it really wasn't a very significant factor anymore. What we did ultimately in the 80s is the stuff that we were doing straight for the comic shops. We didn't put out on the newsstand, so we didn't put a comics code seal on it. We didn't submit it to that system. But even then, the code was not nearly as strict, and it kind of evaporated from there. It was a creature of the newsstands. The organization that ran the code actually did a great deal of good for the comics industry. If you remember seeing pictures of those old spinner racks and what are called waterfall racks that went on the walls of candy stores and supermarkets and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Those were all in America, Canada, those were all organized by the organization that did the comics code. America has somewhat significant antitrust laws, and one of the things that prevents normally is companies that are in the same business working together on anything. And you have to do that very, very carefully and according to very specific rules that are intended to protect the average customer. We can argue whether they're all smart or not, but like any legal system, some of it is started with good intent, some of it is very smart, some of it gets stupid over the years. But the code organization, called the Comics Magazine Association of America, was structured in a way that legally allowed the different comic publishers to get together in the same room, put money into those racks, and finance putting them into different stores so that comics could be in more retail outlets. At their peak, I think the number that I've heard is that there was something like 75 or 80,000 places you could buy a comic in America. And essentially they were everywhere. As the newsstands degenerated in general as a place of doing business in America, that number got smaller and smaller and smaller. But you compare that to comics are now in probably 3,000 comic shops and another 3,000 bookstores in America. So we're in 6,000 places instead of 60,000 places. That means people don't have as much of a chance to discover it. And obviously today you have Amazon, you also have comics being available on the web in different forms. So it's a very different game. But we lost something in just the fact that a kid didn't have a place in the neighborhood to discover comics.
I can imagine your excitement when you got into these offices and see all these talented artists, these talented people that you read on the magazines, on the comics that draw Superman, that wrote Superman. You got the chance to meet great legends like Jack Kirby, for example.
Over the course of my career, I got to meet most of the major creators of the business, became friends with many of them. After a while, you get used to the idea. You don't quite realize how weird it is. I don't think I quite understood that it was bizarre to be a 14-year-old kid and wandering around the offices. I didn't have a frame of reference for that. Maybe I thought that was just what happened.
Okay.
Doesn't everybody get to go over to Jack Kirby and ask him to do the cover of the fanzine and trade for getting it as a thank you for getting it free? I still don't remember whether I paid him $15 or he just did it free.
Oh my God!
I still have the pencils hanging on my living room wall. That one.
Well, then you have the chance to work with him in Kamandi. I think in issue 40 and 44, I think.
Don't ask me issue numbers. I can't remember what I had for breakfast. Don't ask me. It was that far back. I can look it up, but I can't remember it offhand. Jack drew 2 stories that I worked on, which was wonderful. One a Justice Inc. job and another a Kamandi job, both where the editors who usually were writing them were pressed for deadlines and asked me to help prepare the plots for Jack. I didn't get to write the stories fully, but I got to break them down and see how it turned them into art.
And you also got to know Bill Finger.
A little. Bill died when I was still very young. So I met him a couple of times. I essentially wrote his last script because as a young assistant editor, I had given him a check for 2 scripts when he only delivered 1 and then he died. So I owed the company. But I got to know, at least shake hands with the creators of almost all of the great original properties. Never met Marston or Peter from Wonder Woman. Never met Bill Parker, who was the original writer on the real Captain Marvel. But other than those guys, I met and to one degree or another became friends with most of the great creators of the Golden Age characters.
What about Bob Kane?
Sure. No, Bob. I used to be the one who got the phone calls when Bob was complaining about something. I knew Bob. I knew his wife, and then obviously sadly widow, Elizabeth, a lovely woman. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. I was there, contacted DC for, I guess, the better part of 20 years, and got to have any number of dinners with them and conversations, and introduce my kids to them. My kids were little. The kids don't necessarily get it. I was at one comic convention. My daughter was, I don't know, 10 or 11 probably at the time, and she was along. It was a Chicago con, and I brought her along to breakfast with Stan, and breakfast was over, and she said, "He's really full of himself, isn't he?" It's not a lot to be full of himself about, Nikki. But she had her fun. She had a giant crush on Jeff Smith. She loved his Bone comics, and Jeff as a young man, still probably a good 20 years older than 15 years older than she is. Was an awfully cute cartoonist, so she could safely crush on him without doing anything about it. Each of the kids had their own relationship to it. My older son had no use for the comics at all.
Oh.
The younger one is the only one who really enjoyed what I did for a living, and he got to meet a lot of the creators. And he's the only one who went into the creative arts.
My daughter, one of my daughters loves DC superhero girls. So she's in love. She's in love with all that characters, and also the Teen Titans Go.
Teen Titans Go.
They're spectacular because they are for us. Always with Sergio, we're talking about that. All this this cartoon is for us, not for them, because the jokes and everything. It's so amazing.
There's a science fiction historian named Sam Moskowitz who came up with the phrase that the golden age of science fiction is 12. That it's not a calendar set of years, but it's when you come to the material. I don't know that 12 is exactly the answer. Kids grow up awful fast these days. But I do think there's sort of a moment in your life when you have the joy of discovery, whether it's of comics or science fiction or fantasy. You fall in love with Lord of the Rings and Tolkien. That's different for each of us. I have terrific respect for the stuff in Superhero Girls or Teen Titans Go. Mm-hmm. My Teen Titans, the one's drawn by Nick Cardy, written by Bob Haney. The stories are pretty dopey by modern standards. Yes. Bob was a middle-aged guy trying desperately to figure out what teen language was like at a moment when it was changing very rapidly. But it was magic for me when I was 10 or 11 years old. And your daughters are having the magic of discovering this current version. And that's one of the wonderful things about comics, that the characters can change and be a little bit different for each generation. You look back on the Golden Age material. I'm enormously respectful of the work that was done then. It's kind of hard to read today. A lot of the art is very primitive by modern standards. The stories are very simplistic because they were intended for people who didn't have a lot of education. I don't know. I'm amazed that some of the things that I wrote 30 and 40 years ago are still being read, because the world just changes around you. And I'm thrilled that people are still picking up the Great Darkness saga and saying, they still think it's a good story. That's cool. Will they still be saying that 10 more years from now? I'm not so sure. But that it's lasted this long is wonderful.
the thing is that you wrote a lot of cool things, a lot of things that endure through time, and like your participation in the Legion, your legendary participation in the Legion with Keith Giffen doing team up there and giving us this saga that you mentioned, the Great Darkness saga, and bringing back Darkseid.
Mhm.
Darkseid, and a villain that it's now there on top of the mountain.
That,
Everybody knows who Darkseid is now.
well, people just weren't paying enough attention to Jack's work that week. And
Yeah.
you know, what pleased me is not only the story survived, but one of Jack's grandchildren mentioned to me that he actually liked the story enough to still keep it sitting around the studio. You know, and we got to take care of Jack a little bit on that. I mean, you know, his family has now done very, very well, thankfully, off the settlement with Disney a couple of years ago. But in his lifetime, Jack made no royalties off the many Marvel characters he created.
Mm-hmm.
Made nothing off the various TV shows and the couple of really bad early Marvel movies. And he was making money off Darkseid and the New Gods characters when we made toys of them. We worked out a deal to make that possible. And he was so happy about that. You know, he and Roz would give interviews and, you know, make the point that he had made more off Darkseid than he had off the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, and the Hulk put together. And you know, as someone who's a fan, who grew up loving these characters, loving these creators' work, that I was able to make some of their lives a little bit better. Again, not individually. Jeanette had a role in that. Other executives at DC, Dick Giordano, Joe Orlando, people whose names you wouldn't know because they were, you know, accountants or lawyers somewhere in the system. But that we were able to make life better for these guys was really a crowning achievement of my career. You know, in most of life, if we're lucky, we can pay it forward. You know, you have a teacher who helps you, you eventually get to help a student, right? Mm-hmm. Whether you're a teacher or you're an advisor or you're a coach in some fashion or another, or a parent, but you're paying it to the next generation. I had the really great luck that I was able to pay it back in many cases as well as pay it forward. Mm-hmm. And that's a terrific feeling when you're talking about, you know, what you said a couple of minutes ago about getting to meet these people who had done the work that I loved when I was a kid. In many cases, I didn't just get to meet them, which was honor enough, pleasure enough, but in a lot of cases, I was able to make their lives better. Not just the traditional DC guys. I remember great pleasure coming out to my assistant's desk one day, and she would keep this pad of phone calls that I should return. And there was a note that John Romita had called, and he had just received a reprint check for some dopey romance story that he had done 30 years before, 20 years before for DC or something like that. And he'd left the message, you know, tell Paul thank you, and it's more than I made drawing the story in the first place. John is just this wonderful talent who was not only one of the great comic artists, but one of the great teachers. He was responsible for training really a generation and a half maybe of Marvel's artists as their art director.
Yes.
He, Dick Giordano, Joe Kubert, probably the master teachers out of that generation of art. And you know, here's a guy I never had the chance to work directly with, and he's smiling enough off a check that probably bought him and Virginia a dinner. Probably wasn't any larger than that, and not at a top restaurant either. But it made him happy enough to want to pick up the phone and talk about it. That's a great feeling.
An awesome feeling. It's something that makes you happy because it talks a lot about what you do and who you are.
I don't know about who I am, but it certainly talks about what I was able to do.
Mm-hmm. You know, Mr. Levitz, talking about all the things, and you pay tribute to that generation that you enjoy reading. I recently read one of your stories called. It's about the defeat of the of the JSA.
Yeah.
This one.
Yep. No, I know that one. It's one of the ones that's been reprinted most, and one of the ones that has both had the most effect on DC continuity while they were using continuity.
Mm-hmm.
That's next up. That's next up. That's not going to be remembered as long as the defeat of the Justice Society, but you can actually buy that one in another month. Comes out April 20th from Dark Horse.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'm trying to go back.
But I really enjoy that this story. It's amazing. Really amazing.
Couple of things that we got here to.
A lot of pretty pictures. Oh God.
Yeah.
There's a couple up there that I would people not to read, but.
What the Weird Adventures comic? It's the one that you spoke about. Of the writing duties you took.
The one that replaced Bill's last script.
Yes.
The little Aquaman story in the back of that.
The second one is the one Mario has spoken, and the third one it's this all-star comic with Justice Society when you got to introduce Huntress.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember of this doing this comic or doing this all-star comic with Joe Staton, for example?
Well, Jerry Conway had come over to DC from Marvel as a writer-editor, and he basically had to create his own workload. So he was allowed to create several new titles or revive old titles. And among them was bringing back the old Justice Society characters who I had fallen in love with from the JLA JSA team up since I was a kid. And Jerry did, I don't remember, 4 or 5 issues, and then left the company to go work at Marvel again. I had been his assistant while he was at DC. I knew the JSA characters well, so I was able to wrangle the assignment of taking over writing that. And I got to do a couple of issues with Wally Wood, which was amazing. Those were, I think, Wally's last jobs in mainstream comics. A couple of years before he passed away. Sad last years for him. Such a genius. And after Woody gave it up, Joe was a budding young talent in the field, and he came on the book. Joe is as clean a storyteller as I've ever worked with. I always found it a real pleasure to dialogue over his pages because just the flow of the panels, the flow of the action always made perfect sense to me. We enjoyed playing together thoroughly. And I don't remember all the details, but we got in a discussion with Bob Layton, who was an inker on the series, and Bob's always been a very, very creative person, very involved in the plotting of different materials. But DC, Marvel, Valiant, wherever he has been in the industry over the years. And we started talking about, we only had Power Girl as a girl in it, maybe we need another girl, should we bring back the version of Batgirl? And through those discussions, it morphed into being the Huntress, who ended up being one of my enduring contributions to DC mythology. If you see if I can make this work. I'm not a very good camera guy. Yeah, there we go.
Oh, original art.
Oh, look
at that.
My
Look
God.
at that.
So that's an oil painting that Joe did for me as a housewarming present in, I think, 1978. Very, very rare for him to have worked in oils, at least at that time. And I get to stare at that as I work most days.
What a decade, the 70s, because there was a reinvention and many new characters like Ra's al Ghul, Talia al Ghul, and all the things with Batman mythology, right?
You know, the good thing about comics in those years is that nobody was paying too much attention. So you just got to try stuff. And the vast majority of it is not anything anybody remembers. That's true of my stories just as it is anybody else's. Denny O'Neil was probably the best writer working for DC on average over the course of that decade, for example. Well, he gave us Talia, he gave us Ra's al Ghul, he gave us many, many other worthwhile things. But if you stacked up the comics he wrote, there's a stack with Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and his best Batman. Yes. And then there's his Wonder Woman, which he wishes he had never written. And, oh my God, I named the character I Ching.
Yes.
And we all did stuff like that.
It was a flaw, right? That thing with Wonder Woman was a flaw.
You tried something. You threw something. You threw something out there. We weren't getting paid enough that these things were long projects, deeply thought out, lots of drafts. You know, it was what you did this week. And sometimes you had a really good week and you had the Huntress. And sometimes you had a week like that Teen Titans issue that you were showing there, where it was sort of, if nobody ever reads that again, I'll be perfectly happy.
But you, I think it was your idea, the introduction of Mal Duncan as the Guardian, or was Bob Rosake's?
It might have been Bob. I think Bob might have given him that part. I don't think that one was mine.
And what about the relationship between the original Guardian Harper and Roy Harper, that they were like relatives?
I guarantee you that one wasn't mine. I don't know.
Thank God.
That one was not mine.
And talking about the Huntress, but I want to talk with the other Huntress. What do you think about the Hunters who appeared in Birds of Prey, the movie?
It was a nice check. When we went through Crisis and we had to reinvent the Huntress, and Joey Cavalieri was the writer on it, and he came up with the whole mafia princess story. It was a good solution, and it kept the character alive. And the character that was on screen had some elements that go back to what I did, but it was a smile to see, and it was certainly a smile just to see something that I had touched up there. And then it was nice to get the check, which, is not going to buy a house or a car. There were an awful lot of characters in that movie, but it's a lot better than a dinner, let me tell you that. And that's a better way for things to work. And Joe got his check, and Bob got his check, and deserved as well. You hope it's better when people success are aligned with each other. You know, if something works, it should work for everybody who's involved in it to one degree or another. There's no magic formula for what number makes it right or which people should be included. You know, if you look at comics in the 1970s and the 1980s, colorists weren't getting royalties because coloring was viewed as a more mechanical craft. There wasn't a set of tools available to do it as artistically as there is now. Today, colorists share in the royalties of the success of things.
Yeah, that I think it's a real triumph for all the people that collaborate doing the final product and for the effort doing it, because I think as you told in the past there wasn't enough credit for all those people.
Absolutely. Yes. Look, you would. It's not just comics that have these things. The scientific industries tend to treat their great scientists well, but usually there's not a financial participation. I sure hope the people who came up with the Moderna vaccine that got shot in my arm last week get more than a cookie out of it. You know, these are people who are literally saving the world. And the companies that are involved, I don't know what they charge for the vaccine, but if there's some of these companies are selling 1 billion doses of a vaccine they make between the different countries that they're selling it to, if they're selling it for $10 or $50, I don't know, but it's a lot of money. And you would hope that they're turning around to the key scientists who made the most important discoveries in the process, and in some fashion or another saying, thank you very much. Here's something a little better than dinner, a little better than a gold watch.
Yeah.
Not just because it's right, but because that also is a message to all the other scientists working there and who will work there in the future, that if we triumph, if your genius lets us do something that's important, your life will change too.
And also is inspired to others.
Absolutely.
Of course.
And that was our philosophy at DC. We wanted to create an environment that said to the creative people, there's a reason to try your best and to bring your work to us. And we'll do the best we can to sell it and market it and edit it and collaborate with you. And not everybody left happy, and not every relationship worked perfectly. Some of them are well known for their not working perfectly. But lots of them did work well, and lots of people ended up making good money in the process. And winning awards and being recognized for their talent and going on to other things in their career.
Yeah, I think it's important in all life aspects, because what you're telling about the comic industry also can apply in I don't know, Mario's job, my job. I don't know.
Everyone's.
In a lot of jobs. I mean, there are some jobs where you you don't have the opportunity to know what you succeed in. I teach now, right? I teach at colleges, universities. It would be wonderful if one of my students went on to do something amazing in life. The odds that I will know if that happens are very small. And the odds that that will connect back in some fashion, teachers do incredibly important work. I have great debts to my great teachers. I was able to say thank you to a number of them, but they didn't get a check for it. One or two of them I got to take to lunch somewhere in the deal. Lots of jobs, you don't even have that level of recognition available. You don't know. You don't know what to do for somebody's life.
Exactly.
The doctor who saves a patient.
I think that just a kind word, a gesture, it's all that matters.
It's a good thing to make the gesture. It's a good thing to do go the extra mile.
As you said, pay it forward.
Yeah. If you can't do more than that for the person themselves, do it for the next person.
Talking about the comic books industry and everything, because now it's bigger, it's multimedia. I want to ask you, what happened when the film industry start with Superman in the 70s, and then in the late 80s with Batman? It was very hard, very difficult to work with that kind of stuff, because they're the biggest characters of the company, right? Superman and Batman.
Sure. Well, the technology wasn't there to do these things easily. I got to watch some of the filming of Superman 1 as a kid, and I'm standing there on the streets of New York on West 57th Street watching Chris Reeve get hauled up on wires on a crane to do that scene where he plucks the cat burglar off the side of the
yes.
And it looks outrageously uncomfortable, incredibly complex and difficult. You could never do the kinds of things that are the commonplace of the movies of today. But it was an enormously successful film, the sequel as well. Chris was a phenomenally talented actor. He was perfect for the role.
Did you get to meet him?
Oh yeah, any number of times we got to.
Oh my God!
Together a little bit. I very vividly remember the last time I saw him before the accident. We were at the premiere of Goodfellas at the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, at the theater within the museum. I remember talking to him that evening.
Was he a guy of comics, or he just?
I don't think. For his generation, Chris wasn't a lot older than I am. Probably 8 or 9 years older than I am. For our generations, everybody in America read comics. It was unavoidable. I don't think he was a major comic book fan. In the same way that, let's say, Tim Burton was, or Chris Nolan.
Or Nick Cage. Nick Cage, for example.
Or Nick Cage. What about that story? Because it was that stories that they never made it about that movie. Because
it's a good thing. It would not have helped his career. I've seen the photos of him in the costume for the screen test.
What about the Thanagarian spider?
Great career. That was not the role for him.
Have you seen the documentary about the
Superman Lives?
Superman Lives?
No. I lived enough of it. I don't need to see a documentary on it.
Well, Paul, let's go ahead and talk about something that I would like to speak. That it comes from something that you mentioned, that you in those days you did some things that really didn't matter. So you just did it. Like, for example, kill the Batman of Earth 2.
Right. Yeah, you didn't have to have a conversation with anybody about, is it okay to do this? It was just a story.
And I really got impressed, because when I had the issue, I expected, like, I don't know, something spectacular, something long, and it was so simple, so because it was a part of a multi-story issue. So it was just, I think, the first chapter,
Yeah.
and that was all. That was all. Bruce Wayne died, and that was all. There was no explanation. There was no trouble about continuity.
No flashbacks, no nothing.
I mean, I don't think it was one of my best stories, so I don't remember it that vividly, but you know, the whole thrust of the Justice Society comic at that point, the All-Star stuff, was the generational transition. And we had shown an aging Superman, an aging Bruce Wayne, and death seemed a natural part of it. As a writer and as an editor, I guess, as well, I was never reluctant to have characters die and stay dead, because it is a part of life. And when you're dealing with the large casts of characters and things like the Legion or the Justice Society, if you demonstrate that there can be consequences, the next stories are much scarier, are much more suspenseful. It's really hard to write the regular Superman comic.
Oh,
Ultimately, first of all, there have been 5,000 stories already done, so those are all out. But on top of that, you know that Superman's going to live. You know that Lois is going to live, that Jimmy's going to live, that Perry's going to live, that everyone that the reader really cares about is still going to be there.
Mm-hmm.
How do you create real suspense in the process? And on a good day, a good writer succeeds, and thankfully Superman's had many good writers, but it's very hard to work. When you're dealing with these large casts of characters, you can get rid of somebody. And that says, all right, nobody is entirely safe. And that makes for better storytelling, I think.
Mm-hmm.
and here's and the issue when you told the story of the origin of the Justice Society. What do you think about the portrayal of the Justice Society in Stargirl? I don't know if you watched the show.
I've seen a couple of episodes. I haven't seen the one with the Justice Society yet. I ought to catch up on that. You know, Jeff is deeply knowledgeable about all this material and cares about it. He's great at working at it. So it's wonderful to see him playing with the old toys.
And here, at last, we got the Stalker, a character that you created with Steve Ditko.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a 4-issue miniseries with Steve.
Not 4 issues, but not a miniseries. They hadn't invented the idea of a miniseries. Conan was selling well for Marvel. This was the mid-'70s, and the comic book industry was not in great shape. So periodically, it would, DC at least would respond by, we have to add more comics, we have to cut down the number of comics, we have to make everything monthly, we have to make everything bi-monthly. On this occasion, Carmine Infantino, who was then the publisher or president, head of the company, I forget his exact title that day, said, Conan's doing well, we should have some sword and sorcery comics. We walked down the hall. Denny, start something. You're 2 months late. Joe, start 2 things. You're 2 months late on one of them, you're 3 months late on the other. And Denny started Beowulf, which my friend Mike Buslin got to write. And Joe, I'm Joe's assistant at the time, so I'm in the office that day. Me, can I do this? I like sword and sorcery, Joe, please. And he says, well, I'm gonna go home, come up with something. I was a big Michael Moorcock fan, still am. And I kind of channeled some elements that I had loved in Moorcock's work and twisted them around and came back in the next day with a 1-page typed pitch, the idea for Stalker. I was there, I was breathing. David Michelini, who was Joe's other sort of young and underemployed writer, came in with the idea for Claw, the Unconquered. And we each got a shot. I was lucky. Joe assigned my project to Steve and to Woody. And so there I am, 17, and I've got a comic being done by 2 of the real grand masters of the field.
Incredible.
Carmine was not an enormous fan of either Ditko or Wood's work, and he was not a fan of my writing at that point. Much more reasonably not a fan of my writing than of their work, because I was just beginning to learn how to write. So before they even had any sales back on the series, he canceled it as of issue 3. To explain to you a little bit of the difference in technology and how the world worked, his secretary accidentally typed issue 4 onto the next production schedule, and Carmine decided that it was easier to, since she had typed it, rather than making her retype the production schedule or something, do another issue. I got to live to issue 4. And I had, if you go back and look at the comic, if you have the opportunity, I had written it to, I thought, a nice ending at the end of 3. It could wrap up the series. And I had to quick figure out another nice ending to wrap it up at the end of issue 4. Not complaining. But it was just a different world. It's so hard to explain.
What about your relation with Steve on this series?
You know, we got along well. We got along well all the years. I mean, I got some nice notes from him over the years about Stalker. We worked together on another series called Starman years later. We had some good times on that. He did some good work on that, a couple of other stories. I think we did the last kind of mainstream thing that he did on double-sized boards for Mike Friedrich's Imagine, the ground level. Steve is when they shifted from comics being drawn twice up to 1.5 up, really had a dramatic effect on a lot of artists' styles. Some, it was just sort of from one interesting style to another. Gil Kane is one of the most interesting transitions that way. You can really instantly tell which size Gil was drawing. Other guys, it really helped change. Neil Adams, when I talked to him about it many years afterwards, said really what drove the change is that you could now see the entire page as you were drawing it. The twice up, it was just too big to really take it all in your sight at the distance you were working at the board. Neil's a smart guy and a brilliant artist. I am not an artist. I'm not going to argue with his explanation. But for some artists, it was really a negative change. I think Steve was one of the guys who never worked as well 1.5 up as he did twice up. And when we got the chance to do this job for Friedrich for Imagine, I talked to Steve about it, and the one request he made was, can I draw it twice up? And Friedrich had no problem with that, with the way Imagine was being produced. It wasn't a technical problem. So I think it was one of the last really gorgeous things that Steve drew. Just a little 8-pager, but he was so good at creating fantastic worlds that seemed real. Just incredibly beautiful stuff. Wonderfully talented man.
Yes, he created also one of my favorite characters, the Question.
Yep.
Then Danny did an amazing job with that character. It's amazing, really amazing.
That was a brilliant run that Denny and Dennis did together. Absolutely. And that's again part of the magic of comics. That's when you asked about my feelings about Huntress. We get to build on other people's work. My Huntress doesn't exist without Bob Kane and Bill Finger's work, Dick Sprang's work, even Shelley Moldorf's work. Mm-hmm. So many creators who worked on Batman before. So I have no right to bitch if I don't like what the next guy does building on top of mine. And I don't think Steve ever had an issue with what Denny did. He may or may not have bothered to read it, but it was just, I did mine, I got paid for mine. It's your turn, do your thing. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of us felt that way. Not everybody, but a lot.
So now, Mr. Levitz, we wanna go to the bone here with the Legion. We can't speak with you without speaking of the Legion. Let me.
I don't know if I'm getting it on the screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah. Oh. Is that what I think it is? It's the cover of the treasury.
Yep, the cover you were just showing.
Yes, it's amazing. It's
I don't have a lot of original art, but the stuff I have is, from the things I worked on that I really loved.
It's lovely.
It's amazing. And here's an issue that I think is your favorite story of the.
Maybe. It was certainly one of the stories that moved me the most as a kid.
Why?
Job.
Do you remember why it touched you so much?
Well, I think again it's about consequence. He had killed the character Feral Lad. That was a very powerful story. And I guess I was just old enough at the time to have a sense of mortality, that people could die. And I'm not a religious person, so I don't have a particular belief in a afterlife. But something about that maybe had some effect.
Mm-hmm.
You want Mario gets.
Yeah, I want to ask you about Legion, and I want to talk to you about Crisis on Infinite Earths, because they did something amazing with that comic book. And why did you allow Mr. John Byrne eliminate the Superboy stories?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that I'm wearing two hats at that point. I'm the business guy for the company, and I'm the writer of the Legion. Mm-hmm. The business guy for the company certainly knew that the most important thing we could do at that time was relaunch Superman effectively. We had an enormous sort of bake-off of top talents in the industry competing to be the guy who would remake Superman. Jeanette ultimately chose John. Turned out to be a very good choice, very successful choice. John had a clear point of view of what he wanted to do. I had a solution that I thought could make it possible to not have to eliminate Superboy within that, but John wasn't comfortable with it. And the business guy had to turn to the writer and say, listen, kid, the money's over here. We got to make Superman work. So shut up and figure out some way that'll make John happy. Not that John was being unreasonable in any fashion. He just had a creative vision of how to make the character work more effectively.
Is it true? Is it true that one of John's idea was to Lara travel to Earth pregnant, or it's not, or it's a myth?
I don't remember that happening, but it's possible he had that idea in the conversation.
Now you mentioned John Byrne.
It's a lot of years, guys. You got to understand, as important as these things are to the readers, and they are important in the fans. And I, as a comic book fan, the stuff that I read as a kid, I debated all of this. For those of us who are working in the business, it's that day's work. And at the same moment that we're relaunching Superman, we're trying to figure out how to do this crisis thing. We're trying to figure, is there anybody who can make Wonder Woman a decent comic book?
Mm-hmm.
I had tried. It's one of the comics I wrote really badly, in my own opinion. We're changing something with distribution. I'm working on that. At that moment, we're trying a new printing technique over here. Maybe I have to go on a trip to the printer to watch how this new press is going to operate. You're dealing with all of these different things at the same time. And the amount of time you put in on, should Lara be allowed to live in and be part of the story is 5 or 10 minutes conversation in the middle of 15 other things.
Yes.
And unless it's something that you had a particular strong emotional connection with, or that you were powerfully the advocate for or against, that was Monday.
Yes.
And today's Friday. And don't ask me what I did on Tuesday. This too much. We were putting out at that time, I don't know, 500 comics a year, something like that. By the time I left, probably about 1,200.
A lot.
The stack of contracts that would come to my desk every week to sign, were like this. It's a mass business, and that doesn't mean love doesn't go into each project, but love goes in from the people who are putting the most time in. The editor, the writer, the artist, the other people who touch it much more lightly.
Paul, is it true that you were responsible for hiring Mark Wolfman, Alan Moore, John Byrne?
No, it's a bad Wikipedia. That got stuck in there some years ago. I was part of a team that was responsible for many of those things, but very few of those things are one person's decision. Marv probably had more to do with bringing George over than anybody else. Marv had worked for DC before I had, years before I had. He'd gone over to Marvel. Was I one of the people who was trying to talk him into coming back to DC? Absolutely. We were poker buddies. We were good friends already of quite a number of years by that time. I'm sure Len Wein, who was his very close friend from most of his life, who was at DC already at that time, had more influence than I did. I'm sure Jeanette was involved in it. There's a lot of hands in all of these things. And comic book fans like heroes, they like villains, and they like to personalize. Sometimes you can personalize it. There's a singular person who's responsible for something. But the awful lot of the time, there's many hands involved.
Also, I would like to ask you about Legion. What's your favorite Legion story that you wrote?
I did?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I have a favorite of the Legion stories. Maybe the Universo Project arc.
Oh, that's before the death of Superboy. Couple of issues before.
Yeah, I think so. I really liked how that one turned out. I remember when I first met Brad Meltzer, when Brad was coming in to write Green Arrow, and they were bringing him around the office, and he came in. He was already a very successful published novelist, and he was introduced, and we started talking, and he's telling me that he's a great fan of my Legion stuff. And then he starts, and they always say Great Darkness Saga was your best story, and then Censor Girl was your best mystery. But I think Universo Project was a better mystery than Censor Girl. And here was, one of the really most successful mystery writers of my generation singling it out. And I tend to agree with him.
Also, I would like to tell me which one of these comic books did you enjoy writing most?
Oh, out of that batch, it's definitely Dr. Fate. Well, two things. The Legion, the third run of Legion, the Power Girl and Huntress material, all of that was set in the mainstream DC universe at a time when there were a lot of frequent changes of editorial direction. Oh, we're doing the new 52 now. Everything has to start fresh. Oh, we're going to do a book called Legion Lost. So we're going to take these 7 characters that we've chosen out of your storyline. Huntress and Power Girl. Yeah, you got to have to do a Huntress story. She can be Helena Wayne. Oh, wait a minute. No, she has to be Helena Bertinelli. No, she has to be Helena Wayne in the story. And again, I was on the other side of the desk. I understand the pressures. They were just trying to make things work and be successful. And in many cases, for the line, those were good decisions. But as a writer, it was much less fun. Dr. Fate, we were just sort of off in a corner. Sonny is so goddamn smart and so talented. It was a delight to work with him. And it was something different. It was fun.
Mm-hmm.
Also, this something that I realized it was that you really tried with the Legion. You really tried, but the line didn't help.
Maybe the third time was too much. I have to take some of the blame myself. I can't put it all off on the editors. But, the moment didn't help. Certainly, I agree. But maybe I had told enough Legion stories. It's okay. Plenty of time for somebody else. I haven't read what Brian's been doing with it, but I hope he's having fun with it, and I hope the readers are.
I think you have a lot of Legion stories to tell, Paul.
Oh no.
you still have fuel on your tank to tell these stories. I think I really think so.
I'm never going to try and predict what's going to happen in the future of my life or the future of the world. But I think I've done enough with that. We'll see. I've got some other stories to tell, some other characters that I love that I'm getting to play with. So we'll see how it all goes.
Such as?
Sadly, not announced yet, but it was originally supposed to be scheduled for release this summer, and it's gotten pushed back a little bit. But hopefully we'll get scheduled shortly and announced shortly.
Oh, cool.
Oh my God!
And ending the interview, we would like to tell us about how was creating this seal with Karen Berger.
I had good luck to hire Karen when she was a very young person, fresh out of college. And over a period of years after that, as she developed as an editor, it was clear that not only was she not a comic fan, and therefore had a somewhat different creative approach than most of us who grew up as fans, loving specific earlier material, but she was a voracious reader, a very, very literate person, that she had very specific tastes in the kinds of comics she wanted to do, and a lot of skill as an editor developing it. And the joke around both The Office and many of the retailers was that those titles became called the Burgerverse. And it became clear it really was something different and special. And we made the decision to separate it, do it as a different imprint, so we could use different contracts, different rate structure, different work process. And Vertigo both became the model for a lot of what the industry is, with the series put together in sequential trades. And for a time, at its peak, it was the number 4 comics publisher. It was larger than Dark Horse, larger than any of the independents but Image. If the statistics had been available to people to see the numbers. So it was quite an accomplishment, mostly to Karen's credit. The rest of us were just the supporting players in the process. I have an essay I'm pleased with. It's running in the next of the DC in the 80s collections, entitled "It's All Karen's Fault," that really talks about the birth of Vertigo that way.
It was. I think Vertigo was a total fresh bunch of comics that it was amazing the things that creators and I think they have more freedom on Vertigo than on DC Comics. And
well, a couple of reasons. I mean, it was clearly intended for a more adult audience.
Yes.
For the most part, they weren't working with brand name characters that we were using in any other way. So, you want to do something weird with Animal Man? Who cares? We haven't made 29 cents on Animal Man in the last 40 years.
You know, Mr. Levitz, that the Animal Man it was published recently in Argentina, and I'm such a big fan of that book, the first book, because they're going to launch the others. But I was thrilled, and it's amazing, that comic book.
A lot of wonderful imagination. I mean, Karen was responsible for bringing into the business more top writers than any other editor really ever in the history of comics, I think. And she got them young. and she got them when they were ready to. They were fresh and they had new ideas kind of burbling out of them, and she really got some amazing stuff out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another thing that here my partner Mario is fan of, and it's this.
Ah, yes, of course.
He's a big fan of this book.
Thank you.
I got this, but I don't have the others. But I love it because I'm a journalist. This is my job as a journalist, and also I am a comic book fan. And when I wrote my articles, I used a lot of these things. So thank you, Mr. Levitz. Thank you so much.
That was a great experience. I mean, I was going to get up from the desk. I was still around the office for a while. We'd started the project a couple of years earlier with Tashin to celebrate our 75th anniversary. The editors hadn't managed to find a writer who could put it together. The art directors had been accumulating the art and figuring out the visual look of the book. Josh Baker, who's the main art director on it, had done some amazing work already. And Steve Corte, who was the lead editor on it, came to me and said, "Look, you're not going to have the day job as an excuse anymore. You want to write this. It's a tight deadline, but you're a fast writer, and you know this stuff better than anybody else, so you should be able to do it." And it was great because it really, I think even more than the individual comics, reminded people that I was a writer. And won an Eisner, which was wonderful. When I was a significant comic book writer, the Eisners hadn't started yet, and by the time they had started, I was a very insignificant comic book writer. So I was not likely to win one for my comics. I wasn't the flavor of the day anymore. So writing about comics history, I was able to do that, and wonderful experience.
Why the huge book first, and then the small ones?
Tashin's just not like any other publishing company. They have strategies that just don't match anybody else. Benedict started out running a comic shop in Germany. He was a great Disney fan, so he had real love of comics, and he's just runs a fantastic and wonderfully strange company.
I saw it a couple of times, and it's huge. And also, I saw a picture of you holding it, and it was like a coffee table.
Yep, 70 pounds.
A coffee table.
It's a lot of books.
There's also another book that you got nominated for the Eisner. It's this one.
Yep.
Can you tell us briefly about this book about Will Eisner?
Well, Eisner's one of, to my mind, I would argue one of the maybe four greatest geniuses of comics. Kurtzman, Kirby, Eisner, Barks would be my top of the food chain. And Will is remembered occasionally by people as the father of the graphic novel. And Contract with God had been pointed to as, this is the first graphic novel. And really, it wasn't, and he wasn't. He didn't come up with the term. Richard Kyle, who was a comics fan, had come up with it years before. But Contract was a pivotal moment. It really was the thing that convinced a generation, and a very important generation of comics creators, that you could do something that mattered. And when you look at Alan Moore's reaction to it, Frank Miller's reaction to it, Neil Gaiman's reaction to it, so on down the line, they all point to that book coming out as really a pivotal moment. So when I was offered an opportunity to write a book about Will, it really struck me that that was the moment that was important, to really put the beginning of the graphic novel in context, talk about what had preceded him, but to point to why that book was as important as it was, why Will was as important as it was. And it was wonderful to get nominated. It was frustrating not to win, but I lost to Bill Shelley's book on Kurtzman, and that was a wonderfully researched book. And in retrospect, very happy because Bill passed away not that many years after, and he was one of the real first generation comic fans and has done some wonderful scholarly work on it. And I'm glad he beat me. I already had an Eisner. I didn't need it. Didn't really need a second one, I guess. Would have been nice. But it's an honor just to be nominated, right?
Right.
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
It's the honor. And to finish,
good, because it's 11:04 here,
yeah,
Yes.
way after my bedtime.
this book that it came out on December, I think.
No, it comes out in another 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Then we are on time to get it. What can you tell us about Unfinished Business? And
It's the story of a priest, a rabbi, and a minister who walk into a bar, except they're all dead, and they're there to find out what their unfinished business is. So, sort of a classic English language joke beginning, and I don't know. I guess I was just listening to a version of the joke one day. And I thought, well, you could make a story out of that. What really happens when they walk in the bar? Oh, well, okay. What if they're dead? That'd be cool.
Well,
Ty Frazier, who illustrated it, wonderfully talented guy who's done a lot of work on Kingsman, Doctor Who, and a couple of times we wandered around New York picking locations that he would draw. The book is very much set in New York, and it's a very different kind of thing for me. It's a little bit of it's not a traditional mystery like Brooklyn Blood was a much more traditional story. It's just kind of an idiosyncratic story, and it's a guy who isn't religious writing about a bunch of religious figures. But I had a couple of friends who were rabbis, one very dear one who passed away during the work on the book. I have a very good friend who's an Episcopal priest, and have known some Catholic priests who I've liked and respected. So maybe that all affected my portrayals. We'll see. I'll be very curious to see if there's any real reaction to it. There's so much being published these days. It's back when I was a fan, you could own every graphic novel for many years. Now, I don't think Bill Gates could afford to own every graphic novel, or at least not without giving up some of his philanthropy, which is probably a better cause. But check it out. It's
we will. We are looking forward to it.
Of course.
So Mr. Levitz, we really appreciate your kindness to answer every question we had, to share your anecdotes and your career with us. It's a pleasure to have you here and to share this with the Argentinian fans, because it's something that we don't have much opportunity to do. And technology.
I was invited to a convention in Buenos Aires a couple of years ago, but it's really hard to clear the schedule to travel that far. I hope one of these days to be able to get down there, but I have not yet. And
Please, and if you come to Argentina, I will sign me my book, please.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the support on all the projects, and have a good evening.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
We're gonna say goodbye in Spanish. Gracias, gente. Acuérdense, dejen sus likes, suscríbanse al canal y gracias por estar ahí con el señor Paul Levitz.
Paul Levitz.
Así que
nos vemos.
nos estamos viendo. Chao, gente.
Bye bye.
Gracias.
Bye bye. Sorry, I'm monolingual. Take care.